Hi there, Alison here with another Cab Franc du jour. Today's wine is taking us to Chinon, and we're looking at the Clos de Capucin 2019 Chinon. Before beginning her journey as a vigneronne, Fiona Beeston developed a passion for wine from an early age, which led to an accomplished career both as a wine merchant and wine writer. After working her first harvest in Bordeaux in 1976, she later went on to work for the great Stephen Spurrier at his Cave de la Madeleine in Paris, and also as a buyer for renowned caviste Lucien Le Grand. During her time as a wine merchant, she also began writing about wine, and for 2 decades had a regular column in France's leading wine publication, La Revue de Vin de France. But it was in these early years in her career when Fiona was traveling a little bit more across France, meeting and tasting with vignerons, and she became quite fond of the Loire Valley during this time, and later developed a special friendship with Chinon's own Charles Joguet, whose wines were a revelation to her in these early years. So when it came time for her to switch gears professionally, and the opportunity to purchase Clos de Capucin became available, she was assured by Charles that this was an exceptional terroir and that this was an opportunity not to be missed. So in 2010, Fiona took the leap and became propriétaire-vigneronne of Clos de Capucin, and her first vintage was 2011. Realizing rather quickly that her vision for Clos de Capucin required a little bit more patience, in 2012 she purchased an additional 1 hectare vineyard just a few kilometers away from the Clos so she can make an early drinking style of Chinon, a wine that she calls Fiona Beeston's perfectly drinkable Chinon. Clos de Capucin takes its name from the order of the Capuchin monks that first established themselves in France in 1574. Over time, the monks set up smaller chapters of the Capuchin order across France, and it is believed they settled in Chinon in 1604, establishing their convent and grounds where the Clos is today, just a couple hundred meters from the Chinon fortress. As was customary of monastic traditions, wine was central to their faith and part of their daily rituals and routines. And for this reason, it is believed that these were some of the first people to cultivate grapevines here at the Clos. Now, among the convent's most illustrious residents was Father François Leclerc du Tremblay, who resided at the convent in the 1610s. Père Joseph, as he became known, rose to power alongside Cardinal Richelieu, who was chief secretary to King Louis XIII and one of the most powerful people in France at the time. Now, unbeknownst to many, it was actually Père Joseph who was calling the shots and making the decisions behind the scenes, and he had a huge influence on French policy and politics during this time. And because of Père Joseph's unique role in French history, he became known as the original Eminence Grise, or gray eminence, a term that was coined and has been used throughout history to refer to someone who is a powerful advisor and decision maker operating behind the scenes. Following the French Revolution, as was the case with everything relating to the church, the convent and its grounds were dismantled and the land sold off. It wasn't until the 19th century that the original parcels of the Clos and the land that made up the Clos were then reassembled under the Napoleonic Register to become what is now Clos de Capucin. Following phylloxera, it is presumed that a gentleman named Charles Moreau is the one who replanted the Clos with Cabernet Franc vines in the early 1900s, and many of these vines are still in the ground today. However, there's very little evidence of any significant winemaking activity that took place at the Clos during much of the 20th century. Now, if we fast forward to the modern era, it is Rodolphe Raffo of Domaine Jean-Maurice Raffo who was contracted to manage the vineyard and make the wine from 2001 to 2007. Shortly thereafter, the Clos was then sold to Domaine Baudry du Tour in 2008. Now, their tenure was short-lived and did not amount to much because they too quickly sold the vineyard and put the vineyard up for sale, and the buyer was Fiona in 2010. So Clos de Capucin is taking us to the Chinon commune, which is a commune that I have spoken about in great detail in other videos and posts, because this commune has a wealth of historic and highly regarded vineyard sites that are dotted all across its viticultural landscape. Now, that said, it is worth revisiting a few of the key themes that influence viticulture here. So first and foremost, while we do find vineyards on both sides of the Vienne River, the majority of the viticultural activity and significant viticultural activity takes place on the north side of the Vienne River. And this is an area that stretches about 4 kilometers from north to south and about 6 kilometers wide from east to west. And the majority of the vineyards are dotted around the perimeter of the Chinon village itself. Now, in terms of the topography of the Chinon commune, it is rather varied and undulating. So we will find any number of exposures here: north, south, east, western exposures, and everything in between. In terms of elevation, the elevation of the vineyards ranges from around 40 to about 100 meters above sea level. And if you've been following me for some time now, you may recall that elevation in Chinon can give us a little bit of an indication as to what soils we find where. So in the eastern part of the Chinon commune, east of the village itself, this is where we find the Premier Côte, and then the vineyards above and to the north of the Premier Côte. So Chinon's Premier Côte is the first in a series of pockets of sloping vineyards that begin in the eastern part of the Chinon commune and then stretch east into Cravon-les-Coteaux and into Pont-Zoul. And the Premier Côte is where we find a number of highly regarded and somewhat historic vineyard sites like Clos de l'Olive, Chêne Vert, Clos Guillot, Côte de Noailles, and others. These vineyards are typically at elevations around 50 to 80 meters above sea level, and this is where we find the influence of predominantly the Upper Turonian yellow tuffeau chalk bedrock. In terms of topsoil, the topsoil tends to be on the shallower side, and we will find a variety of textures depending on where you are. Now, sitting north and literally directly above the Premier Côte is where we find another collection of vineyards that are at a higher elevation, 80 to 100 meters above sea level. And here we find a completely different set of soils, a completely different type of terroir. And these soils are deeper soils generally, and we have more clay here, and clay mixed with flint that dates to the Sinonian age. And these soils are known locally as cornuelle or also perruche, depending on the pedological composition of the soil. As we move west, closer to the village and into the village of Chinon, there is a cluster of vineyards right in the heart of the village, just right near the Chinon fortress. Clos de l'Echo would be an example of one of these vineyards. And these vineyards also sit up at a higher elevation, 80 to 100 meters above sea level. And similarly to the vineyards that are at the same elevation in the eastern part of the Chinon commune, we also find those cornuelle and perruche, so those heavier clays that are mixed with flint. And there's also another type of clay with flint and quartz that dates to the Bartonian age as well. As we move further west still to the western and northern parts of the Chinon commune, this is where we find vineyards that are following the perimeter of the highest elevations of the village. And here we find vineyards that are at elevations of around 55 to 80 meters above sea level. And similarly to the vineyards that are at a similar elevation in the eastern part of Chinon, this is where we find the influence of predominantly the Upper Turonian yellow tuffeau chalk. And there will be pockets of miage here and there, as well as alterations on that yellow tuffeau chalk as well. The topsoil across the western and northern parts of the Chinon commune can vary a bit in terms of depth as well as texture. Now, in terms of this western part of the Chinon commune, what's interesting is there is a stretch of vineyards that's about 1 kilometer long, starting from just west of the Chinon fortress. And this is where we find another important côte. And similarly to the Premier Côte on the eastern side of the Chinon commune, this côte on the western side of the commune also has a few of these rather highly regarded historical and in some cases vineyards that have a bit of a religious significance to them, like Clos de Capucin. So we have Clos de Capucin here, we have Clos de l'Hospice, Clos de la Lizardière, we have Saint-Louis, Setti, and also Clos de Parc, just all on this other côte on the western side of the Chinon commune. Now, drilling down to Clos de Capucin specifically, at least from a viticultural perspective, as I mentioned, we're in the western part of the Chinon commune here. And the vineyard is about 1.3 hectares in size, and it is a true walled clos that's been divided into 4 parcels. The vineyard faces the Chinon fortress directly. You can see it from the vineyard, and it's on an east-facing slope. And the vineyard elevation ranges from around 63 meters above sea level at the bottom of the slope to about 80 meters above sea level at the top of the slope, and the slope is a moderate grade. The bottom 2 parcels are actually sitting just above Clos de l'Hospice. And these 2 parcels is where we find the oldest vines in the Clos, 90 to 100 years of age. The soil here is a little bit more shallow and it's a clayey sand texture. And then we hit the upper Tronian yellow tuffo chalk bedrock rather quickly after that. The upper 2 parcels at the top of the slope, these are west of where the original convent structures would have been. These 2 parcels have slightly younger vines, 45 or so years of age, and the soils here are deeper in terms of deeper, as well as a bit more richly textured. And I also should note that the vines that are the oldest vines on the property, those that are 90 to 100 years of age, Fiona is using that vine material now to do replantings by selection massal. If we're looking now at the winemaking for this wine, the yield from this clos is quite low. We're talking 15 to 17 hectoliters per hectare. The fruit is all hand harvested. It is all destemmed. It's all hand sorted and hand destemmed, I should say. And then the whole berries are fermented in a 50 hectoliter oak foudre with indigenous yeast. And in terms of the time on skin, it's about 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the vintage. So in case of the 2019, it was 4 weeks on skins, and she's doing very little by way of extractive techniques during this time. It's really just the occasional pump over just to make sure that the ferment stays nice and healthy. In terms of the aging takes place in used DRC barrels, and the aging is for around 2 years. And the aging does take place in those underground tuffo cellars that those monks would have used for winemaking some 400 years ago. So let's dive into this wine. So the nose is really starting to open up now. I will admit that when I first opened this wine a few hours ago, it was a little bit on the tighter side, but it is now starting to become much more expressive. I would say the fruit profile, I would say that this actually leans a little bit more on the earthier side, which is really nice. And that earthiness is then supported by a really nice sweet tart mix of fruits. Very pure fruits. There's just that perfect ripeness of the fruit profile. And I would say it's a mix of red and darker fruits. I'm getting a bit of black and red raspberry. There's a bit of cherry here. Touch of black currant perhaps as well. Maybe even a little bit of blueberry here too. Yeah, it's quite pretty, and there is a really lovely purity and translucency to the nose, which I quite like. The earthiness is gorgeous, and it's just all the best elements of Cab Franc when it can be on that earthier side. It's like herbs like thyme and sage. There's a bit of an evergreen shrubbery thing like cedar leaves and cedar wood. Some serious foresty vibes going on, which I totally love. Yeah, there's a bit of moss. There's some potting soil or sort of wet earth. It smells great. There's a nice florality to the nose, like violets. A little bit of a delicate spice to the nose, but really what leads here is a nice fruit profile and those nice earthier undertones, which is really quite lovely. The fruit comes through bang on as it did on the nose. And I would say there's a little bit more of that black currant note kind of punching through in a really nice way. And then the palate comes through with the spice. And I love the profile of the spice. You do sense there's a little bit of a wood kind of barrel spice thing going on in the background. Like I'm getting like a touch of like a cinnamon stick-ish note, or maybe allspice as well. But the varietal spice is really quite lovely. It's very delicate, and it has almost notes of cardamom, a bit of star anise as well. And what's also coming through on the palate, which I really love, is a beautiful stoniness. Like there's a stony minerality, almost reminiscent of, you know, kind of wet stones. I know we say that in Psalm speak all the time, but yeah, it literally is reminiscent of, you know, you see a babbling brook and water kind of rippling over, you know, kind of smooth stones. And that's kind of the mineral vibe that I'm getting with this wine. The acidity is really bright, really lively, very elevated. It's got that nice kind of lift. It hits up here in the palate, which is quite nice. It's very persistent as well. There's that nice kind of mouth-watering impact on the back end of the palate in particular. The tannins are lovely, and that was something that I noted when I was making my notes earlier, is the mouthfeel was just exquisite. There's a silkiness of how the wine feels on the palate, and then it finishes with that just classic velvety texture, like crushed velvet texture. Beautiful uniformity to the tannins, and just that little bit of chalkiness on the finish as well. The wine overall, it sits much more vertically. I sometimes talk about wines being round or broad. This is a wine that feels like it's going up. It is vertical, or almost linear, but it feels almost more vertical to me rather than linear. And there is a fine-boned nature to this wine. Like there is this kind of ornate feel about the structure, but at the same time, there is this lovely flesh that is kind of enveloping that structure in a really nice way. So it doesn't feel too austere to me. Sometimes when there's that ornate structure, it can feel a little bit tight, but this actually, there's that nice flesh and fruit that kind of works with that structure in a really nice way. This is a stunning wine. It's so elegant. And what really strikes me with it is there's a weightlessness to it. And I'm not really sure how it's doing that, but it feels weightless. There's density and there's depth and there's concentration here, but at the same time, it feels so effortless as well, which is really impressive. It's sophisticated, it's poised, but it feels really honest as well. It's a really exquisite wine. And actually, this is my first time trying this. I picked this bottle back up in Chinon when I was there in April at a little caviste in the village, and I'm so glad I did. Oh my goodness! I met Fiona back in June, and she was just such a gracious individual, and we had a really lovely chat. So it's so awesome to finally taste this wine, and it is a stunner. It's going to be a tough one to find, though. I have to say, I think the production is around 2,200 bottles a year, so very small production, and I'm not sure of her export footprint at the moment. So I will, if folks have, want to know, just shoot me a note and I would happily look into that for you. But this is definitely one to keep on your radar. Hopefully it will make its way through some of the channels, over the course of time. But it is one, especially if you're traveling to Paris, to keep on your radar for wine lists and things like that, because this is a gorgeous wine. And just the history of this site, it's like that it's like ticking all the boxes for me, like from an emotional standpoint as well, because there's just so much rich heritage to this site and so much love and care that you can see that she's putting into working this vineyard. So This is one that perhaps unsurprisingly I think is fantastic and would highly recommend folks seek out. And if you have had the pleasure of tasting the Clos du Capucin, I would love to know what you thought of it in the comments below. And of course, as always, I will be back again soon with another wine. Cheers.